And so when you talked about guidelines and, if they go over those guidelines, might have some toxicity, right? And we are hearing that World Health Organization just says we cannot have any levels of benzene, right? We hear different levels of guidelines. Guidelines I learned from Tammy McMullen that was on that slideshow, who actually defended extraction oil and gas in their case at COGCC, was talking about benzene levels in the guidelines. Guidelines apparently, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, are not enforceable, and standards are. That's the issue I have with guidelines, first of all. Secondly, we don't have any guidelines for these compounding, effects. Can you just shed some light on how all of these guidelines were developed, just so that we know how guidelines are developed?
Yeah, sure. So the state of Colorado relies on guidelines that are produced by other agencies that have more than the 2 toxicologists that we have in the state of Colorado. I'm one of them. Agencies like EPA, they have a huge program that looks at toxicity. We also look to the CDC's Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. We also rely on agencies like California EPA that has about 100 toxicologists that work for its Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and also the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They have about 20 toxicologists. And so we have developed a tiered framework for sort of whose guideline value we would pick, and it falls in line with sort of federal guidance, where EPA's toxicity values and ATSDRs are higher than state agencies because of the sort of resources and rigorous scientific review that those agencies put forth before they promulgate or establish those guidelines. The basic process for establishing a guideline is similar for all of the agencies. They essentially do a thorough literature review of all of the scientific information that's out there, and essentially graph all of the information that's out there. What sort of studies do we see? Where do we see effects in animals? And ideally, what level can we expose animals or people to and not see any effects? And we call that a NOEL, the no effect level. And what we try to do is use all of the evidence to understand, okay, does this make sense? Is it some weird study that maybe, we don't see any mechanism where that could happen? We don't understand how it could happen, but we try to take all of the information and use it to build a comprehensive picture of what could be happening with that chemical. We look at different types of toxicity, like effects to the liver, effects to the kidney, effects to the bone, effects to the nervous system, things like that. And so we try to look at all of that and decide which one of those is the most sensitive. Where do we see effects at the lowest levels? And then we pick that as what we call a point of departure, or basically the crux of the health guideline value. So once we establish that number, for instance, for benzene, for the acute number for benzene from ATSDR, they use a study where mice showed effects at the lowest level of 10 parts per million. They then translate a dose in mice to a dose in people because of scaling of body sizes. They translate that, it becomes a human equivalency dose of 2.5 parts per million, or 2,500 parts per billion. They then use uncertainty factors to account for other differences between mice and humans, to account for differences in sort of timing, to account for differences in the information that we have. They then add an uncertainty factor of 300, and that gets us down to that 900 parts per billion. So even if we exceed, 9 parts per billion, even if we exceed that health-based guideline value of 9 parts per billion, we think that we still have quite a bit of safety between where people, 10 parts per billion, right? There'd still be a lot of safety there if people were exposed to a little bit higher, and the level at which we see those effects in our studies. What we don't account for necessarily is how it can interact with other substances. And it's very rare that we have enough information, toxicity information, to be able to quantify those interactions. And so for general purposes, we use that hazard index approach where we add everything together that could cause a blood effect or a kidney effect all together and look at what that looks like all together.